Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here. Good morning, everyone. I'm Angela Knight from the Office of the CIO. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on Washington's approach to regulating facial recognition, and it's presented by Matt King in the Office of Privacy and Data Protection. And just as a reminder, this session is being recorded. And you'll notice as you joined the session, your microphones were automatically placed on mute. So we'll want to keep everybody muted until we kind of have a break for questions. If you do have a question for Matt during this session, just let me know via the chat feature. Matt will pause at the end of 3 different sections to answer any questions that are there. And also, I wanted to let you know we'll be sending out the slide deck after this session to everyone who's on the invitation. So, Matt, if you're ready, go ahead and take it away. Matt, are you there? Hey, Matt.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
We lost the screen, though. We lost the screen sharing.
Okay.
You're still the presenter.
Okay, can you still hear me?
Yep.
All right, excellent.
And we can see.
Great. Thanks for the introduction. As Angela mentioned, my name is Matt King. I'm a Privacy and Open Data Manager in the Office of Privacy and Data Protection in WATEC. And thanks to everyone here to participate in this introduction of facial recognition and our Washington facial recognition regulations. Facial recognition to me has always felt like a technology of the future, but in many ways it's here in both the public and private sector, and it's been here for quite a while. But that hasn't always been obvious because it's largely unregulated and there are many applications without much transparency. It's been gaining a lot of media attention over the past months and years, as well as attention from Washington state legislators. And I think it's a really important topic that I'm excited to talk about today. So we're going to start with just a quick overview of what facial recognition is, go over some of the main concerns that have been raised about its use, and then talk about what happened during the 2020 legislative session, and specifically what happened with SB 6280, which some of you will know are new facial recognition regulations that are now the law of the land in Washington. So at a very simple level, facial recognition is technology that analyzes facial features and is used to verify or identify a person. It's one specific use of biometrics, which is a broader term for any physical or behavioral characteristics that could identify an individual, like fingerprints or iris scans or voice prints or gait analysis. Modern facial recognition technology is made possible by the use of artificial intelligence and deep learning, and specifically advances in neural networks that are essentially a series of algorithms that are designed to detect patterns. And we'll talk just a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. For today's purposes, facial recognition does not include facial detection or characterization. So facial detection is asking the question, is there a face here? So you can think about this for something like the autofocus feature on your camera that knows or it can recommend where to focus the picture. Or it could be used for counting the number of people in a crowd. And as long as the people aren't actually identified in it, it doesn't raise significant privacy concerns. And facial characterization is technology that analyzes facial features to make determinations about things like someone's gender or whether they're smiling, but doesn't necessarily identify a person. So that could be useful for an ad company that wanted to put up different ads on a screen, depending on whether the person walking by was a male or a female, or tailor it to their age. Could also be useful for a blind person to help them detect facial expressions or social cues that otherwise they wouldn't be able to pick up. Characterization doesn't always come with significant privacy concerns, but there can be privacy or other concerns depending on how it's used, such as if it's used for predictive analytics, like trying to predict whether a person who's visiting a store is likely to be a shoplifter, or using film of a job interview to determine if a person is likely to be a good fit for the job. This is a very high-level overview of the facial recognition process, and I'd say it's much higher than even a 30,000-foot level. And basically, the process starts with developing an algorithm using a sample, and preferably a very large sample of images. And this process is called training, and it's where the neural networks are used to teach the algorithm how to detect patterns and identify people using a variety of facial measurements. Once the algorithm is trained and deployed by a facial recognition service, it's loaded with information about known people, so people whose identity is known. And we'll discuss that a little bit more on the next page. And finally, after that, it is used to actually verify or identify people. So one of the essential functions for facial recognition service to be successful is having images of the people whose identity is known. So you have something to compare images against. And the process of adding these people is called enrollment. When a new image is added, the facial recognition technology performs a process called extraction, where it takes measurements of the person's face and converts the picture from an image into data about that person's face. And the data is called a template. And once that template is created, it's added to a database or gallery. And once the template's created, the original image is no longer needed for the technology to work. So theoretically, it could be discarded, but there may be other reasons to keep the original images, like if you had retention requirements, if there were other business reasons to have the images, or if you wanted to do human review of the results. But from a technology perspective, it's no longer necessary because the service is only using the data in the template. In practice, there's a lot of variation in how the enrollment process may work and where the images come from. So some services may use high quality images from things like a driver's license or a passport photo or mugshots, whereas others that have received some public attention recently may scrape information from publicly available sources like social media. It's also possible that individuals might be directly involved in creating the template, such as if you set up a new phone for Face ID. Once the technology is in use, there are two primary ways the use is described. One is verification, which is also called one-to-one. And this is where you're basically asking the question, is this person who they say they are, or are they who I think they are? So the obvious example is verifying identity of a person for access to a device or a place. And in this process, an image is taken of the person whose identity you're trying to verify. Facial features are extracted and converted to a template, and then that template is compared to the template of the person that's already in the gallery, and either confirms or rejects that it is the same person. With one-to-many or identification, you don't necessarily know who the person is, and you're asking, who is this person, to put a name to a face. This process starts the same way as one-to-one by taking the image and extracting facial features to create a template, but the template is then compared to the entire gallery to identify the person. Um, there are many, many ways those two basic functions could be used in practice. And I want to highlight a few of them before we go on to talk about some of the concerns with facial recognition technology, because I think it's important to acknowledge the potential benefits for individuals and society. So the ones that we hear about a lot are public safety and security. So from a public safety perspective, um, this technology has a tremendous amount of power to help identify criminals, locate missing persons, and respond to terror threats. From a security perspective, it can be used to manage access to secure devices or to secure locations. It has a lot of capability to automate what are now manual processes. So one that has actually been implemented in places is using the technology at airports to speed up waiting times. So in a future world, you may not need your driver's license to check in and check bags, or you may not need to scan a ticket when you board the plane. Delta has technology that they're already using in some airports where instead of having a ticket, you can just essentially walk onto the plane and it scans your face to confirm whether you're somebody authorized to board. And then there are obvious convenience applications. So we're getting more into commercial uses here, but for those of you who use social media, you probably think it's useful to be able to tag a friend on Facebook or have your phone create custom albums of your friends or family. Or you may be able to use your face as a replacement for other tangible things now, like you might be able to use your face instead of a credit card to pay, or use your face to confirm access to a bank account instead of your ATM PIN code. And then with accessibility, I'm really thinking of examples like the one I gave before of helping a blind person identify people or social cues. But there obviously are concerns with the widespread use of facial recognition technology. And I think the biggest one is one that I find, in honesty, kind of hard to describe because it seems so obvious and self-evident. And it's just simply how pervasive the technology could become in your everyday life. You can't change your face. And there are some suggestions that based on improved technology, in the future, you won't be able to hide it in public either. So with the widespread use of the technology, you could literally lose the ability to be anonymous in public spaces. Even if you've never done anything wrong, that you're not, if you haven't been in a criminal lineup, you don't have a mugshot, you haven't committed a crime, it's entirely possible that you're already in a facial recognition database and don't know about it, such as the Clearview AI service, which is, again, a highly scrutinized service that compiles its gallery by scraping images from public sources like Google and Twitter and Facebook. I think it's also important to note that mass surveillance is required for some public safety functions to work. Like if you're trying to locate a missing person, which I think we could all agree is a valid purpose, actually using facial recognition to look for that person in a public space means you're also surveilling everybody else who's in the space to rule them out as the missing person. And then the final example I have up on this page is an image on the left, which you may recognize as being from Facebook. So this was an augmented reality function that Facebook was developing that would have allowed people to point their camera at a person in public, and Facebook would tell you who the person was and whether you were friends. So this was never actually deployed, so I can't comment on the privacy controls it would have had. But it does highlight that those types of functions are very realistic and that companies are thinking about them. Another related risk is simply the fact that the tool is so powerful that it's ripe for abuse, and there are serious concerns about whether it'll be fairly used. Clearview AI, which we just talked about, has publicly said that it is only used for law enforcement, but there are reports that it is also given access to individual citizens. So this article on the left is about this gentleman who is a billionaire owner of a grocery store chain who used Clearview to take pictures of people that his daughter was dating and find out who they are and what they did for a living. And then there are also significant concerns about how the technology might be used to chill protected rights. For example, in 2015, a Black man named Freddie Gray was arrested for possessing a knife by Baltimore police, and he later died while being transported in a police van. His death triggered protests and riots, and it was later revealed that law enforcement used facial recognition to scan protests, identify protesters, and target any of them with outstanding warrants. Another very well-publicized criticism is accuracy. The technology is not perfect, and there have been many studies that show facial recognition services are less accurate for younger and older people, women, and people of color. So I would say this could be its own presentation, and there are a lot of resources out there about it. So I'll just leave it at saying the algorithms appear to be getting better, but depending on the context, the consequences of a mismatch could be huge, such as if someone is misidentified as the person who committed a crime. These concerns have not gone unnoticed, and there have been calls from everyone from activists to legislators to the Vatican calling for regulation. But despite the calls, there's not a clear consensus about how to regulate the technology, and most places that have addressed it have issued moratoriums that either ban the technology altogether for a period of time or ban it until some predetermined thresholds are met. And that was the context going into the 2020 Washington legislative session where we had new bills introduced. And before I switch over to what we're doing in Washington, I think this would be a good place to pause for any questions that have come up.
So I don't have any questions in chat, but if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, this would be a good time.
Yes, I have a question. If someone has reconstructive surgery or face surgery to change their appearance, would the recognition pick up on the underlying bone structure, or would it pick up on, in other words, to be able to know who that person is before the surgery, or would it pick up on just what's visible on their face post-surgery?
I think it would depend on the significance of the changes and how good the technology is. So I think the understanding is generally you can't normally change your face. It's possible that there could be significant enough changes. There are also changes over time. So the older an original template is, as you age, it gets less and less accurate. But the technology is getting better. Also, I saw an article, I think it was just last week, about a man in China who was identified now in his mid 30s based on a picture of him when he was 2.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any context or regulation that talks about local storage? The current trend in the industry for Windows 10 and mobile devices is to do a template on a local TPM chip on the device, and it never leaves the device. So the risk is minimal, other than the device being compromised. Is that taken into consideration?
So we're going to talk a little bit about scope going forward, but I think the short answer is right now, those types of uses don't have any specific regulations around them. But I imagine as the policy conversation moves forward, that those are the kinds of things that will be considered.
You mentioned that these technologies use things like Facebook for the initial gathering of images they're scanning, is there a comprehensive database or a comprehensive list of sites these might use, like Tinder, Hinge, Bumble?
So it really varies from service to service, and I don't have a comprehensive idea of which services would use which sources. The only reason that I even have any insight into Clearview is because there's been so much scrutiny and media attention to it, and those things have been revealed. So no, there's not a comprehensive list that I know of.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to 2020 facial recognition bills in Washington State. So for anybody who was watching this, there were a lot of privacy bills introduced this session, and many of those bills included facial recognition regulations or covered topics like artificial intelligence. So 6280, which is going to be the focus for the rest of this presentation, covered the public sector use of facial recognition. 6281 was the Washington Privacy Act, which included rules for consumer facial recognition uses in the private sector. 2856 would have issued a moratorium on facial recognition, and 2363 would have created an absolute right, an absolute privacy right in a person's own biometrics, and it would have created a task force to make recommendations about remedies for violations of that right. During session 2856 and 2363 did not move forward very far. Private sector pieces of 6281 were temporarily taken out of 6281 and put into 6280. But ultimately, in the end, as the final language of 6280 was negotiated, they were taken out. And we were left with only 6280 passing that covers only public sector uses. So none of the other proposals move forward. So this is now the law of the land, and it goes into effect July of 2021. Throughout session, there was a lot of public discussion about whether the technology should be banned or regulated or just left unregulated. And ultimately, the legislature recognized the significant concerns about facial recognition, but enacted regulations with the goal of allowing it to be used in ways that benefit society while prohibiting uses that put civil liberties at risk. It's important to recognize that these rules do not apply to all facial recognition uses in Washington. It is really scoped so that it applies to the use of the technology by state and local government. It does not apply to private sector commercial uses. It doesn't apply to other biometrics uses. It doesn't apply to other artificial intelligence or automated decision-making tools. And then there are some specific exemptions. So the Department of Licensing has a facial recognition matching tool that it uses to verify the identity of people who are applying for driver's licenses or other state ID cards. And that system is not subject to this law. And then there are also exemptions for uses that are required by federal law or that are done with a federal agency at a port. So for example, there are facial recognition tools going into place in SeaTac that are in the portions of the airport controlled by the federal government. And those are the entry points, and those would not be covered by this law. The bill defines facial recognition in a pretty similar way to what we just talked about. But in addition to verification and identification, it also adds persistent tracking of individuals, which we will talk about on the next slide. And it has a couple of exemptions. So it specifically says that facial recognition doesn't include facial analysis to grant access to devices. So going back to the question we had about, I guess, locally stored templates, that type of tool would not be covered by this bill. And then it also has an exemption that's not up here on the slide, that it doesn't apply to a facial recognition process to redact recordings for disclosure, which apparently is a tool that law enforcement sometimes uses in responding to public requests. So these definitions of identification and verification are similar to what we already talked about, but they also added definitions for ongoing surveillance and persistent tracking, which are basically ways to use the one-to-one or one-to-many matching capabilities. So ongoing surveillance is using a facial recognition service to track a specific person through public spaces over time. And persistent tracking is tracking a specific person, but doing it without identifying who the person is. And I just bring these up now because the rules for what you can and can't do depends on whether you're doing ongoing surveillance or persistent tracking in some cases. So the substantive components here, a 6280 are laid out, and I basically broke it up into guardrails for use. So what can and can't be done, transparency and accountability requirements, testing and training requirements, and then the creation of a task force. So starting with the guardrails, the first prohibited use is that facial recognition can't be used to chill protected rights. And the way the law gets to that point is by prohibiting the use of facial recognition based on religious, political, or social views, based on participation in a lawful event, or based on characteristics like race, ethnicity, age, gender, or some other protected characteristic. And it also can't be used to create a record that describes a person exercising a constitutional right. So you couldn't use a picture of a protest to create a record of all the people who were participating. There are some specific guardrails of prohibited uses that apply only for law enforcement. And one of the main ones is that law enforcement cannot use facial recognition as the sole basis to establish probable cause in a criminal investigation. So even if it is used as a tool to identify a suspect of a crime, the fact that there was a match using facial recognition can't be the only reason establishing probable cause to arrest that person. And then the other two examples here are really about image quality. A big limitation of facial recognition technology is the quality of images going in, which, as you can imagine, vary quite a bit if you're capturing them in public spaces. So what these provisions do is they say law enforcement can't use a sketch or a similar image to identify a person because that could result in a significantly higher number of mismatches. And also says that law enforcement cannot substantively manipulate an image. And the reason that it says substantively instead of just they can't manipulate it is that there may be circumstances where there's a partial image or it needs to be cropped or something like that. So that's one that may be interesting to see how it plays out over time. In some cases, a court order is required. And specifically, it's when an agency is going to use facial recognition to perform ongoing surveillance, real-time or near real-time identification, or persistent tracking, then it needs to either get a court order, but that only applies in cases where the purpose is locating or identifying a missing person. It can get a warrant, or it can use it if there are exigent circumstances. And this last one is one that I'm going to be very interested in seeing how it's implemented, because it seems at least possible that allowing use when there are exigent circumstances could be an exception that swallows the rule. Because I imagine in most cases, if you had a need for real-time or near real-time identification, there also arguably will be exigent circumstances. So that'll be another area to watch. There are some specific requirements that apply in criminal cases, and those are that an agency has to provide notice to a criminal defendant before trial if the agency used facial recognition. And then there are additional requirements that apply if the service will be used for decisions that produce legal effects or similarly significant effects. So this includes the list you see here: financial and lending services, housing, insurance, education, criminal justice, employment opportunities, healthcare services, access to basic necessities, and civil rights. So I think many commercial uses wouldn't implicate these things, but as you go through the list, what jumps out to me is that many potential government uses will trigger one of these things. And that means it'll trigger the additional requirements that come with it. And the main requirement is that if you're using the technology for a decision that produces those legal or similarly significant effects, the agency has to ensure there's meaningful human review. And that means review or oversight by at least one person who is appropriately trained and has the authority to change a decision. And I think one of the big key there is going to be that they have to be a person who actually has the authority to change a decision and not just a person who's reviewing it. So moving on to accountability and transparency. So these requirements in the next several slides apply to all uses except for facial recognition services that are already under contract as of the effective date of the bill, which is next July 2021. So if there's a service that's already under contract, it doesn't have to fulfill these requirements until the contract is renewed or extended. The first one is that if an agency is going to use facial recognition, they have to file a notice of intent to develop, procure, or use the service. And that notice has to specify what the purpose of the technology is, and it has to be filed with a legislative authority, which is like the county commissioners or a city council or whatever body is vested with legislative powers for that agency. And for state agencies, and after filing the notice of intent, the agency has to develop a draft accountability report. So the report needs to be clear and understandable, and the things that are listed out here are the minimum requirements. I'm not going to go through all of them because there are a lot of them, but you will get the slides after this. So it must identify the service, describe the data used, including where it will be gathered from, and explain how the data will be used and how the service will be used. It needs to describe the accuracy of the service, the impacts it could have on privacy and civil rights, including what the agency will do to mitigate those impacts, and it has to provide mechanisms to receive and respond to feedback from both impacted individuals and the community. And it has to include a data management policy that includes specific details like how records will be maintained, data access standards, the breach notification procedures, and the plan to monitor any use by third parties, including what types of contracts are going to be in place with those third parties. Once the draft report is completed, there's a public input requirement. So before finalizing an accountability report, the agency has to provide a review and comment period and hold at least 3 community consultation meetings. The agency has to consider the issues raised, but the bill doesn't explicitly require the feedback to be part of the accountability. And after public input, the agency can then finalize the report. When it does that, it has to provide public notice that it's been finalized at least 90 days prior to actually using the facial recognition service. And they do that by clearly communicating it to the public, posting it on the agency's website, and submitting it to its legislative authority. And any legislative authority that receives the report also has to post it on its website. Then once the service is in use, the agency needs to maintain records of its uses that allow public reporting and audits to evaluate compliance with the facial recognition policies. And then excuse me. The information that needs to be maintained also includes maintaining information about any applications for a warrant. And so any agency that applied for a warrant to use facial recognition has to file an annual report each January with a legislative authority that summarizes the non-identifying demographic data of the surveillance subjects. And there's a similar requirement that applies to any judges that consider a request for a warrant to use facial recognition. So any judge that considers that type of warrant also has to file a report each January with the administrator for the courts. And that report has to include more information. It needs to include the fact that the application was considered, the results of the consideration, the period of surveillance, including whether there were any extensions. It has to include who applied and who authorized the application. And then it has to describe the types of public spaces where the surveillance occurred. And then finally, the accountability report has to be periodically updated. So at a minimum, it needs to be updated every 2 years, which means it needs to go through this process again. And then the agency must also seek public comment and community consultation for any new use and update the report. So any new use would be anything that wasn't contemplated in the original accountability report. The bill also includes testing requirements for the technology and training requirements for the people who use it. So agencies must provide training to users on the capabilities and limitations of the technology and how to interpret and act on it. And agencies that are using this must ensure that the service makes an API available that enables independent testing of the facial recognition service. So the testing is supposed to be done to test for accuracy and specifically for accuracy across subpopulations of people with different visual characteristics. And if the independent testing reveals that there is some type of material unfair performance, then the service provider has to develop a mitigation plan within 90 days of receiving the results. And then the last bit on training is that there are additional requirements that apply when the technology will be used to make decisions that produce legal effects. So as we touched on earlier, those types of decisions require meaningful human review. So the people who will be conducting that review need to receive appropriate training. The technology must also be tested in operational conditions to ensure accuracy if it's going to be used in those circumstances. The last thing that the bill did was create a facial recognition task force, and the goal of this task force was to make findings and recommendations about facial recognition technology and potential improvements in the law to protect citizens and ensure that it's being used fairly. But this provision was not funded in the budget, and so the governor issued a line item veto on this. So this is not actually part of the final law. And with that, that is the very quick overview and introduction to facial recognition in Washington. So I'll stop here again for any questions.
Daniel, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself so you can ask your question? I think it was from a previous section.
Evidentiary purposes.
Oh, sorry, Daniel, you were still on mute. I went ahead and unmuted you.
Okay, gotcha.
Can you
I
repeat
typed my
that?
question in, I typed my question in chat, but it's given the emergence of deepfake, what type of tracking is used to maintain the integrity of video if used for legal evidentiary purposes?
Sorry, let me ask again that what type of tracking is done? Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so say you record something out in the public that's being surveilled by, say, law enforcement. Given that you can actually fake video, what controls are in place or assurance can we have that that video is not tampered with, where it's stored?
That is a very good question, and I am not going to attempt to answer it because it would only be conjecture. I think what I can say is that this law does not specifically speak to that issue, and I think that is something that will have to be resolved in court, like any other evidentiary issue going forward.
Will, do you want to go ahead?
Matt, I wonder if you could address whether or not 6280 supersedes or changes the requirements for use of facial recognition as a biometric identifier under 4026.
So
Previously existing biometric law. And do you think that 6280 changes that in any way?
So I haven't gone back and looked specifically at that question. My recollection, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you know a lot about this topic, was that that law had an exception for biometrics that were derived from images or videos. So in that sense, I don't know if there would be a conflict, but to the extent there was, I would assume that anything in this law that's more specific is going to apply.
It was an area was unclear to me as they were doing legislation. I was just wondering if anything had become clear since then. Thank you.
Scott Campbell, did you want to talk about your comment?
Well, yeah, just like when you verify software with a hashing of it, I think we could easily take the video, and as soon as it becomes downloaded from whichever source it is, just take a hash of that. Anytime you edit it, you hash it again, the results should be different. So we could validate authenticity of the video from deepfakes that way. An idea.
All right, thanks for that comment. Okay, Angela, anything else?
I don't have any other questions.
Okay. Well, I don't have anything else. So thank you all for participating today and for your questions and comments. And as Angela mentioned, we will be distributing the slides. And if you think of any other questions or want to follow up on anything after this meeting, feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, everyone.